Hello, everyone. Welcome to our research seminar series from Bridge Thesis Center for Data Science and AI. And we are very delighted to have with us Professor Chiara Farronato. Just a brief introduction here. Professor Farronato is an assistant professor of business administration and the technology and operations management unit at Harvard Business School. She draws from the fields of industrial organization and technology to study the economics of innovation and the internet. In her research, Professor Farronato focuses on the market design of peer-to-peer online platforms. Her work has been cited by media outlets, including Bloomberg Businessweek, the Huffington Post, the Economist, and FT Magazine. Professor Farronato received her PhD in economics from Stanford University. She earned an MSc in economics in a joint program of Bocconi University in Italy and the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. And her bachelor's degree is also from Bocconi University. I'm myself a huge fan of her work. She comes up with in-depth, fewer papers, but very in-depth papers. So I'm personally very excited to have her with us. Thank you so very much once again for accepting our invite. And without further ado, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anuj, for the wonderful introduction. Let me share my screen so that we can get started. I'm excited to present these work. Let me see if it shows up. Yes, okay. I'm excited to present this work. I think it's the right mix of prediction and causal inference for a data science seminar. And most importantly, I would love your feedback. So it's the perfect time for me to present this to you guys. This is joint work with Yorgos Zervas, who's at Boston University, a great colleague and a lovely friend. So let's get started. The motivation for this paper comes from a world of asymmetric information, okay? We have a world in which consumers would like to purchase products and services. Think about cars and the lemon market for lemons. Sellers have some information about the hidden quality or the hidden effort that they've put to provide the service, to provide the good. And the fact that buyers don't know the quality of the services or goods being provided and sellers do may lead to a market failure, may lead to a situation in which either consumers engage in risky transactions that we're not willing to accept from a societal standpoint, or the market completely breaks down. And so a lot of the regulation that exists today is really used to protect consumers from these risky transactions and enforce some minimum standards of quality. But more recently, and I'm sure these resonates with many of you who are attending this seminar today, consumers have turned to review platforms as a primary source of information. Think about your daily life when you have to choose where to eat or where to go buy something. How many times do you read reviews to inform your choice? So the goal of this paper is really to understand the role of online reviews in informing consumers about specific dimensions of quality, in particular, the dimensions of quality that historically regulators have cared about, in this context, restaurant hygiene, and increasing restaurant compliance with hygiene standards, okay? So if you think about the restaurant, now that they know that a consumer is informed about their hygiene through online reviews, will the restaurant put in more effort to try and comply with hygiene standards at a higher rate? And so the question is really split up in two parts. Which dimensions of restaurant hygiene, if any, do reviews reveal? Because restaurant hygiene, even if we think of it as one sort of single dimension, it actually has a lot of sub-dimensions, from food temperature to worker cleanliness to paperwork. And this is a prediction task. We want to try and predict restaurant hygiene from reviews. Okay, and so we're going to utilize machine learning and natural processing tools to try and really extract information from online reviews that is specific about restaurant hygiene. And then we want to ask, with this sort of signal of hygiene, whether the disclosure of restaurant hygiene in consumer reviews is going to affect demand, so the consumer's choice of where to eat, and supply, restaurant compliance with hygiene standards. And here it's really causal. We want to see whether A causes B, right? So the signal, the existence of this signal causes certain behaviors on the consumer's choices and the restaurant's choices. And so we're going to try and use event study approaches and differences. So just to give you a preview of the results, what I'm going to show you is that consumer reviews provide some informative signals for front of the house violations. So things that the consumer actually does see and can talk about in online reviews, okay? Note that we haven't constrained that to be the case. It's sort of an ex post result, which gives us comfort that what we're capturing is presumably what consumers are truly understanding from online reviews. But consumer reviews are not that informative for back of the house violations. For example, facilities maintenance, that the regulator has nonetheless deemed important in affecting consumer protection, in ensuring consumer protection. And then on the causal side of the exercise, we find that negative hygiene signals actually significantly reduce the probability that that restaurant is sold out, and the effect size is half the effect of a low star review. Okay, so think about having a review with low stars. Half of that effect is maybe due to hygiene signals. And then on the supply side, restaurants that are more visible on Yelp, we find that they violate less along hygiene dimensions for which reviews are more informative. Okay, so we have these policing mechanism of reviews that have an effect on how much restaurants focus on avoiding pests and mice and food that gives people stomach aches. All right, so briefly on related work, there's a bunch of related work along these dimensions around predicting expert decisions and understanding sort of the problems with information mechanisms. One is sort of the bias of online reviews. We should keep that in mind when we sort of extend the conclusions that we find in this paper to sort of a world in which maybe reviews have a bigger role in informing consumers and policing service providers. But one thing that of note is that there's actually review literature also showing that inspectors have discretionary power. And so actually having this balancing effect of reviews in combination with inspectors, some of whom may be discretionary, may actually be helpful. And then we're going to try and combine sort of these largely distinct fields of analysis, studying the effect of information from health inspections on demand, okay, and from online reviews on demand. So we're going to try and merge the two by looking at the effect of hygiene extracted from Yelp reviews on consumer demand. All right, so the data come from 3 different sources. I've been, sometimes you need to be creative. I collaborated a lot with companies, but this is actually the first project of mine where I don't collaborate with companies. It gives me a little bit more independence in the things that I can study. But it also requires me to combine data from a bunch of different sources, which is pretty exciting. So we have data from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. We obtained these via a Freedom of Information Act request. So you can go to this office and say, hey, I want data on a bunch of different things, and they'll give them to you. We have the entire census of restaurant inspections from 2007 to 2016. I'll tell you in a second what these inspections are like and what they entail. We have about 60,000 restaurant and 500,000 inspections. We have everything about these inspections, violations, closures, and what's also important is inspector IDs here. And then finally, through this information, we also have restaurant characteristics, location, cuisine, entry and exit that we can also use to match the restaurant to Yelp, okay? The data from Yelp comes from scraped data that are publicly available online. Even right now, you can go on the website and find what we have collected back in the days. It's 3 million reviews for about 30,000 restaurants. Note the large gap here. Even if we think that a lot of restaurants are on Yelp, effectively only about half of the food serving entities, even in a city like New York, are on Yelp. And that limits our ability to say, okay, online reviews tell us everything about every service provider that we may actually interact with. So there's still huge scope for experts to come in and actually inspect those service providers that, for whatever reason, are not online. And then we have data from OpenTable. So for about 3 years, we've gone to OpenTable and scraped the availability of each restaurant in New York City, okay? We have about 2,500 restaurants that were active on OpenTable at that time, to check for availability at 7 p.m. for a table of 2 people, okay? So every night, we know whether one of these 2,000 restaurants is available to be booked at that time. So we use that as a proxy for demand. Okay, if you're sold out, your demand is high. If you're not sold out, your demand is low. Okay, just a caveat on selection. We mentioned that, you know, the sample size sort of significantly goes down as you move from all the restaurants to Yelp and then further to OpenTable. The restaurants that end up at the end of these cuts tend to be higher end restaurants. They're less likely to be fast food restaurants. They're more likely to be in Manhattan. They're much more likely to be sort of what the US thinks of sort of more sophisticated food. And so we just have to be aware of these selection. You may notice a discrepancy from the 60,000 restaurants that I told you before, and that's because actually we have to cut the data a little bit further, conditional on having sort of a relatively homogeneous inspection process, because New York kind of changed their inspection process in the middle of our sample period. Okay, so let me give you a sense of how we think about asymmetric information here, how we think about online reviews helping in reducing asymmetric information here, so that then we can go and use the data that we have to back out what we care about. And I'm just gonna pause for a second to see whether there's any questions at this point.
I don't see any question as of now, but I have just one quick question here.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So when you see, when you match the data from the Yelp to the data that you got from the inspections, maybe you'll show up in the empirical analysis, but do you use it like, are you able to map it from each date to each date, or do you use it as an aggregate measure, the restaurant inspection data that you're trying to bring in this data set?
Yeah, so basically we match the restaurants, names and address. And that allows us to match all those restaurants, 30,000 restaurants on Yelp. Okay, so the ones that we were not able to match from Yelp, which are a very small subset, we just don't even include them. Our universe, we consider these to be our universe of data. And then we have dates. And then we have dates for inspections and dates for reviews and dates for availability. But we don't need to match those dates because we've already matched on restaurant.
Okay, I see. Yeah. And also you mentioned that, you know, this is not the universe of all the restaurants that we're talking about. There are certain which are not there, because Mike Luca, I think, has a new paper where he says that, okay, if you are on the platform versus you're not, how that impacts your overall financials.
Yeah.
And with Abhishek and all. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton of food serving places that are giving you food, right? Think about workplace cafeterias
Yes.
that are not on Yelp. But those workplace cafeterias are actually part of the subject of the population of restaurants that the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene has to monitor. And in addition to that, there's the local restaurants that don't need to be on Yelp for whatever reason, that we are missing from all of the subset of restaurants that are our focus. And so we should be aware of that. So I'm glad that even Mike is highlighting that.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let me go to the conceptual framework just to give you a sense of what we think is going on here, okay? Let's assume that there's a true hygiene level for these restaurants, okay? And conditional on this hygiene level, customers are gonna show up to the restaurants and they are gonna see a signal of that hygiene level that's not precise, right? Like it's not going to be exactly the hygiene level. It's somewhat distributed around the true hygiene level in a way that's unbiased, but it's kind of noisy, all right? And as a function of this signal, demand is going to respond, right? They're gonna, if they receive a low signal, they are gonna be less likely to show up at this restaurant. And if they receive a high signal, they're going to be more likely to show up at these restaurants and actually demand their services. Now, think about a world if you think about this world, then you have supply that takes all of these into account, and it's going to choose its optimal hygiene level, okay? Notice that we think about small tweaks to your hygiene, right? Whether you use pesticide, whether you clean your table surfaces, and so on and so forth. So these are like small, not huge investments in hygiene, and we think of them as being short-term. So we're actually going to hold constant the price of the restaurant, okay? And given our analysis, it's sort of short-term, it's kind of acceptable. Okay, if we were to allow restaurants to manipulate even the price, then we would end up in a world with multiple equilibria, and sort of solving this would be very complex, much more complex than we need to, at least. Okay, now think of a world in which we have a more informative signal. What does more informative signal mean? Lower variance, less noise, okay, around the true value of hygiene. And so in this world, actually, demand is going to be more responsive, okay, to the signal, okay, and it's going to pivot. So if you receive a high signal, now it's much more likely that truly that restaurant is going to be high quality. And if you receive a low signal, now it's much more likely than before that the restaurant is truly low quality. And so this demand is going to actually pivot and be more responsive to the signal realization, which is going to lead to supply actually incorporating this increased marginal benefit of quality. And so the restaurant is going to be cleaner. Okay, so that's exactly how we're thinking about the signal from Yelp hygiene affecting the hygiene signal from Yelp as affecting demand, and in turn affecting supply by increasing their incentives to be cleaner. Okay, so what do we need to try and test these model? We're going to need signals of hygiene. We have to build. We don't have them sort of out of the box. We need to have demand, okay, this sort of proxy for this line, and that's going to be our sellout on open table. And we're going to need supply, okay, so how high is the quality hygiene of the restaurants, okay, and how does it change as a function of Yelp? And that's going to be restaurant compliance during health inspections. So we're going to try and build data to try and test this model, okay? So let me tell you a little bit about health inspections in New York City. I'm going to try and be quick, but I'll give you the most important pieces of information that we need here, because we're going to use, the objective is to find certain inspections in New York City that give us label, okay, the ground truth about restaurant hygiene, so that we can train a machine learning algorithm that extracts signals of hygiene from the text of Yelp reviews that are predictive of these ground truth label coming from the inspections, okay? And so Health inspections in New York City are pretty traditional. They conduct these unannounced inspections, so you don't know when the inspector is going to show up, and that's important, of restaurants, coffee shops, bars, nightclubs, cafeterias, a whole bunch of food serving places, with 3 objectives: information, improving food preparation practices, and ultimately reduce illnesses attributable to restaurants. Health inspections in New York City look for anything and everything. They look for environment, temperature, facilities, food handling, worker hygiene, contamination, and regulatory violations. Okay, so these are all the dimensions of hygiene that we're going to try and predict separately. Okay, there's actually 100 of them. We're just going to focus on the 20 most frequent ones. Each violation is going to assign a score, okay, but is going to be assigned a score by the inspector. And then the aggregate score is going to determine the letter grade to be displayed at the door. So the restaurant, when they get the letter, it's kind of a scarlet letter that they need to place in front of the door that informs consumers about the hygiene of the restaurant, okay? And so there are 3 cards, okay? If at initial inspection you score 14 points or less, you get a letter grade A, okay? You get these printed out, you put it at the door, and you don't see the inspector for the next year, okay? Approximately, right? They're unannounced. If you score more than 14, okay, what happens is in a few weeks, and a few weeks later, you're given a chance to clean up. And a few weeks later, you're still going to get inspected. You're going to go through a reinspection, after which you get a score, A, B, or C, okay? So what you notice from these is that the reinspection is actually the event in this inspection cycle that is most likely to affect your letter grade, okay? Initial inspections are much less likely to affect your letter grade, and they are, as a consequence, much more truthful, okay? Inspectors are much less incentivized to sort of strategize, and restaurants as well, to strategize around what grade to give the restaurant. Of course, restaurants have to place this letter at their door, and so there's some inventive ways of placing a B that is not as exciting as an A into the door of your restaurant. But what you can notice here is what I was telling you earlier, that initial inspections tend to be a more truthful measure of the underlying quality of the restaurants. And you can see it here. You can see that there's a bit of bunching right around the threshold, to the left of which you receive the letter grade A, and to the right of which you're getting reinspected, okay? But otherwise, it's a pretty uniform distribution, okay? Instead, in the final score, what ends up happening is that, first of all, there's not as much variation in the hygiene level of restaurants, presumably because restaurants that received a high score are going to clean up, and that's enough to satisfy the inspector, at least in the short term. But then you have a lot of bunching here and a lot of bunching here, which are the 2 thresholds that shift your letter grade from a higher grade to a lower grade. And so for these reasons, we don't think initially re-inspections are as truthful a measure of quality. And instead, we're going to use initial inspections as the underlying ground truth of how clean a restaurant is. Okay. All right. So using that, we can extract hygiene signals from Yelp reviews. Okay. We're going to assume violations during initial inspections reveal the true underlying hygiene standard. And we're going to focus, I told you there's about 100 codes, violation codes. We're just going to focus on the 20 most popular violations, because you'll see that it becomes increasingly complex to sort of disentangle noise from signal if we start adding more and more violations. These account for about 80% of all citations. So these are really the most important violations that we can think of. We're going to code violations as 0 or 1, okay, ignoring the specific violation scores. For all intent and purposes, this is really the biggest source of variation. Are you in compliance or are you not? And so that's what we're targeting, okay? We're gonna associate each inspection. So say an inspection for this restaurant occurs on date T. We look at all the reviews that this restaurant obtained up to 90 days prior. So in the previous 3 months, we go back in time, we collect all those reviews, okay, and all the text that those reviews have. And we pre-process the text of those reviews. It's pretty standard: stemming, removing stop words. We're gonna remove the too frequent and too infrequent words. And then we're gonna allow for words not to just have a meaning in and of itself, but have a context specific meaning. So the word clean, presumably in a 1-star review, is going to have a very different meaning than the word clean in a 5-star review. And so we're going to basically pair up each word with the stars associated with the review that word belongs to. And that is going to be our definition of word, okay? And then we're going to construct a corpus of word frequencies for each inspection. So for inspection 1, you're going to see that, that inspection in the reviews up to 3 months before, it was containing the word lukewarm in 1 and 2-star reviews twice. It didn't contain any instance of roach in 1 and 2-star reviews, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's our corpus. And we're going to predict the frequency of words, the occurrence of words from the violations that inspectors find at that inspection, okay? So we're literally going to predict a bunch of words, okay? We're gonna assume that they are distributed, the frequency of these words is distributed multinomially. And we're gonna regress it on a bunch of controls, such as cuisine, location, and the dummies for whether a particular violation was found by the inspector that inspected that restaurant that particular day, okay? What this gives us is a set of coefficients, okay, that associate each violation to each word, okay? The vast majority of these coefficients, I'm not going to go into the details, but because of regularization, the vast majority of these coefficients are going to be 0, okay? We're going to have a very sparse matrix, but the coefficients that we're actually capturing denote a very strong correlation between the occurrence of particular words and the occurrence of particular violations, okay? And so we think of those as being sort of highly correlated because both the inspector and the consumers are going to be able to look at the conditions of the restaurant, of some of the conditions of the restaurant, and they're going to be able to infer the same information about hygiene, okay? And what is comforting to see is that when we actually look at those words that have the highest coefficients, the highest factor loadings, they're actually oftentimes descriptive of the violation itself. So for example, the violation hot food item not held at or above the right temperature, the words that are most predictive of that violation are words like poison, are words like sick, are words like nauseous, or overcook. And so there's a sense in which we feel comfortable that consumers reading these reviews are actually going to be able to infer the fact that the restaurant may not have used the right approach to hold the food at the right temperature, okay? The same happens for pests, live roaches. You have roach, filth, filthy, which are, again, very descriptive of pests being present in the premises. And so it's really nice to see that we have these close relationships. For other violation, okay, and I'll show you in a second that we can also make sense of this. For other violations, the words that are most predictive don't make any sense. They're just negative words about the restaurant, right? Like they're disrespectful, they're rude, they're nasty, but they're not very descriptive of the violation. I'll show you that for these kind of violations, actually, the prediction accuracy of our algorithm is going to be much lower than the prediction accuracy for these violations, which we take as being our degree of informativeness. Okay. All right. So with these estimated coefficients, now we have these estimated coefficients, we can actually create what we would call a sufficient reduction by multiplying these these coefficients. These are the coefficients, the loadings, okay? We're gonna multiply them by the corpus of words, and we end up with sufficient reduction, okay? What are sufficient reductions at a high level, just to give you an intuition? Okay, given a particular corpus of words, okay, we're gonna have coefficients that are gonna tell us the general likelihood of a particular violation occurring, okay? And what is important is that we can measure this when an inspection occurs so that we can verify how good our prediction is. But conditional on being satisfied with our prediction exercise, we can measure these sufficient reductions at any point in time for the restaurant, okay? It doesn't need to be right around the inspection. Why? Because reviews occur throughout the year. Inspections only occur once a year, okay? So reviews occur throughout the year. We have the factor loadings that we assume to be fixed. And so we can sort of create this index of hygiene at any point in time for each restaurant. And so let me give you an example of what this entails. Let's assume that we have this review, which actually we took from Yelp. Each violation is going to be determined by a set of words. So for example, the violation for 0 to B, the food item not being held at the right temperature, is going to highlight certain words, okay? And then you sort of sum these coefficients and you come up with a sufficient reduction for that violation. And then you can do the same for all other violations, for all other dimensions of hygiene, for example, 04M, which is cockroaches. And then you can see that different words come up as being predictive of that violation. And in particular, the aggregate prediction of cockroaches occurring, given what Peter has said about this restaurant, is much higher than the occurrence of another violation, okay? All right. So now that we have this signal, we want to understand how informative this signal is, okay? And so how do we define informativeness? Well, our definition of informativeness is, can we better predict violations when we add information from Yelp? Okay, when we add hygiene signals that we've built, as I showed you before, from Yelp. Okay, so again, we're going to build a classifier now to predict violations, not to predict the occurrences of words. And we're going to look at the AUC, the area under the curve, without signals from reviews and with signals from the reviews, to see whether the information that comes from Yelp reviews actually adds performance to our machine learning model. And that's our definition of informativeness, okay? So let me give you an idea here. So these AUCs measures are based purely on using the health grade that is displayed at the restaurant door to predict the occurrence of particular violations. Each of these are violations that inspectors care about, okay? And one thing that you'll notice is that this is not 0, this is 50%, okay? But 50% is the lowest possible level where we sort of flip a coin and we randomly guess whether a particular violation occurs or not. And what you see is that the prediction accuracy, the AUC actually, of a machine learning algorithm purely based on grade is pretty low. It doesn't go above 55%, okay? It's relatively low. When we add the Yelp reviews, we do a much better job. Now, do we get to sort of AUC levels of standard machine learning algorithms? Absolutely not. The highest we get to is sort of 67% here. It's not that high, okay? But what's interesting here is that there's quite a bit of a heterogeneity in the improvement that we get across these violations, okay? For certain violations, okay, we get much bigger improvements than for other violations. And so we think of the violations for which we get the biggest improvement to be those violations for which Yelp is most informative, okay? So we rank violations, okay, and we classify them as being more informative, okay, as being Yelp is more informative for those violations, and Yelp is not as informative, okay? We're gonna just focus on these 5. First, then it really, this was an arbitrary choice. We can, our results are sort of robust, the different choices of aggregate measures. And we are going to try and use these signals that we now extracted, that we now showed are relatively informative about hygiene, to see what happens to demand when consumers actually see these signals on reviews, okay? All right. So just to give you a quick summary of what we've shown so far, we've extracted these violation-specific signals of hygiene from the review text. What we showed is that certain words are more predictive of violations than others. And those words for the violations for which we're most confident that the signal is informative are actually descriptive of the violation itself, which is very comforting. But we don't yet know whether consumers actually read these reviews, take the hygiene information into account, and as a result, don't go to the restaurant. And that's what we want to show next, okay? All right.
We take 2 questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are 2 questions related to this. One was, are these hygiene signals and reviews distinguished in terms of front-end hygiene and back-end hygiene?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Actually, we didn't force that to be the case, right? Like, we actually let our procedure rank these violations from, Yelp being most informative to Yelp being less informative. And what it turns out is that here at the top, you have what, a human would describe as front of the kitchen violations. So you have pests, right? You have live roaches, and you have things that give you stomachache. Cold food item, raw, cooked, or prepared food is adulterated, and hot food item not held at the right temperature. Okay, and so these we would describe them as being, and actually there's still flies here, which is quite close as well to the top of these ranking, right? And then to the bottom, you have mostly things that consumers, restaurant patrons would have a hard time seeing, right? Like pesticide use not in accordance, a properly scaled metal stand type thermometer, hand washing facility not provided near the food preparation location. So these are all things that we as human beings would describe as back of the kitchen. So it's an ex post rationalization that to us makes sense.
Right. There's one more question here. People only write reviews. That's a classic thing, that when they are very happy or very sad. So how can you control that?
Yeah. From our perspective, actually, it doesn't matter because if you care about hygiene, right, and you're very sad, that's ultimately what we're trying to predict, right? We're trying to predict the occurrence of violations that consumers don't like. And so if consumers care about hygiene, see hygiene, and want to write about it, then we see it, okay? Let's assume that we wouldn't have found a result that Yelp text wasn't predictive of violations, okay? So all of these columns were just here at 0, okay? Now, that result could have come from what you are suggesting, someone, right? That people don't care about hygiene. They see it, but they don't care about it. They're like, meh, it doesn't really matter. And so they don't write about it. Or it could have come from the fact that they don't see hygiene, okay? But conditional on seeing this heterogeneity, we attribute it to the fact that consumers care about it, and when they see negative things, they talk about it.
One more question, which, if I'm getting it right, is more like if someone writes a review which is aimed towards just demeaning the restaurant or just damaging the reputation, do you control for that, or is there a way to tackle that?
Yeah, so that is a super important thing that we've actually thought about quite carefully, because actually, some restaurants receive a ton of reviews in the 3 months prior to an inspection. So we have a pretty large corpus of words, but on average, our restaurants only have 3 reviews in the 3 months preceding the inspection. So it's really low, and so this concern is actually very important. If it were the case, though, if you only wanted to damage the reputation of the restaurant, okay, that should not have any predictive power on the inspection outcomes, because you would assume that the inspector is not the one who wrote the review, right? And so we are fairly confident that these reviews that exist and are designed purely to damage the reputation of the restaurant, if they are not well-founded, they shouldn't have any predictive power on our ground truth.
And last question is that, so from the consumer side, you see that how you perceive or what importance you give to cleanliness or these kind of hygiene factors vary. So the consumer perception of hygiene varies. And similarly, the rubric that the inspection officials follow should also assumingly vary a bit from time to time, right? They upgrade it or they update it. So do we need to be worried about this, or should we incorporate something that captures the dynamic nature of consumer as well as perception or the rubric used by the inspection officials related to hygiene?
Yeah, so we're actually trying, I didn't mention a lot of the details, but in predicting the occurrence of words from violations, we're actually controlling for a bunch of things that may be correlated with both of them occurring, right? For both words and hygiene levels being on the lower end of the spectrum. So for example, certain cuisines, in certain cuisines, it's more acceptable to be dirty, and we control for cuisine. We control for zip codes because certain locations are more likely to have mice than other locations because the hygiene levels at the street level is worse. And then we control for quarter fix effects, which control for the fact that things may be changing over time. In the summer, it's hotter, and so you may have more mice running around. So I hope that helps in addressing some of these concerns.
Yes.
All right, great. So I'm gonna rush through the effect of hygiene signals on demand and supply, but I'm just gonna show you at least the effect of hygiene signals on demand, because I think that's the sort of strongest evidence that actually these hygiene signals have a causal effect on consumers deciding not to eat at restaurants that are deemed dirty. Okay, so we're going to use sold out on open table. The advantage of this is that we have very few restaurants, 2,500 restaurants in these data set, but we have high frequency demand characteristics. For every day, we know whether a restaurant is sold out or not. Okay. And we are going to assume that at least review submission time for bad reviews is random. And again, to address the comment that came earlier, again, bad reviews that have a negative hygiene signal, okay? So hopefully that's not the reviews that are designed to just destroy the reputation of the restaurants. We're going to use an event study approach and compare demand in the days before and after the review submission. And so if the timing is random, whatever happens in the few days prior, in the few days afterwards, can only be due to that review being submitted, okay? We're gonna focus on events that are defined as days when low star reviews are submitted with hygiene signals among the 20% most negative, okay? So we compute these hygiene signals, we take the reviews with the worst hygiene signals, and we define those times and those restaurants as experiencing an event, okay? And we look at the probability of being sold out of those restaurants 15 days prior, up to 15 days prior and 15 days after. the submission of that review. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the event study plot. What you see is that nothing much happens before the submission of the review, and a lot happens in the days after. There's a sort of a few days of stabilization, but there's quite a pronounced reduction in the probability of being sold out. Okay, now these may just be capturing the fact that this is a negative review. Okay, so we can do a diff in diff type of event study where we actually interact. We use all reviews with low stars, 1, 2, 3, and we interact the day fixed effect with whether that review, in addition to being bad, has a bad hygiene signal. Okay, and so plotting those coefficients, they are noisier, but you can see that again, there's quite a significant decrease in the probability of being sold out. In aggregate, these event studies are going to imply that the bad hygiene signal, okay, interacted with after review dummy, is going to account for about half of the effect of a low star review. And we consider that as being relatively big because it means that consumers really read hygiene and really choose not to eat at restaurants that have mice, which hopefully is not surprising, at least ex post. I know I'm running out of time. So what we do on the side of the supply at a high level, we're just basically dividing violations for which Yelp is more informative and violations for which Yelp is less informative. And we also divide restaurants that are more versus less visible on Yelp on the basis of whether they received the reviews in the last 90 days. We instrument for that. And we would expect better compliance, okay, of restaurants for those dimensions of hygiene for which Yelp is informative and among restaurants that are more visible on Yelp. So it's kind of a difference in differences approach. I'm not going to go into the details, but happy to talk with you offline. What we find is that there is these better compliance, negative effect, okay, both OLS and IV of restaurants along those dimensions of hygiene. And so just to conclude, I think, I hope I showed you some evidence that consumers' reviews contain signals related to some hygiene dimensions and not others, okay? And this limits the usability of online reviews to police restaurants on hygiene, right? But these signals are actually pretty powerful. They affect both consumers' choices and restaurant hygiene. And that has some implications for policy. We should think about substitutability between inspections and online reviews, not as sort of a black box sort of thing, but by task, right? Can online reviews help inform consumers about mice? Yes, no. Can online reviews help inform consumers about employee hygiene? Yes, no. And we should design the policy about experts and regulation accordingly. And with this, I'm going to stop because I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Any questions we have? I think we had few that we covered. I don't see any here in the Q&A. Any questions? Doesn't look like we have questions, but I think your paper is also public. So what we can definitely do is circulate the paper around, and if there is any question, folks can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So it looks like there is no further questions. But this was very informative, and I can see you have done tons of work. Especially, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how you were able to stitch together the data and then try to make it clean enough to do it in panel data and then run regressions. So for me, that's also a big deal.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. For example, because we went through the demand, right? All of these are sort of cuts of the data that require a bit of thought. But so here, what we have is basically for restaurant J, okay, event J, so submission of a review, a particular review for restaurant I and time T, okay? So how do we create these data sets? We look for every restaurant. We look at all the reviews that were submitted on any given day. Okay, we run those reviews through our machine learning algorithms so that we can get to a sufficient reduction. We can get to a signal of hygiene for each constructed from worst to best, and we take the 20 worst. Okay, then we hold constant those days. Okay, so those days and those restaurants, and we go back to our table data, and for those days and restaurants, we pick the month surrounding that event. And that's our outcome variable. And so there's a little bit of processing, but it's kind of challenging, but it's also fun because you have to start thinking. And I think data science is a lot of this, right? Like, you're not given a data set that's already clean and you can do work on. A lot of the work is trying to understand what is your observation, how do we cut the data to get answers that we want. And I think data scientists are great at that.
True. Okay, thank you once again. Do we have any more questions from the audience? No. Yes, great presentation. Okay, that's the peak.
Thank you.
Yeah, I got some internal messages like this is one of the most rigorous work I have seen. So it looks like, yeah, that one can see through that. This is rigorous work. That's what you call it. Very painstakingly done. So I think thank you.
It's been on our desk for a long time. I have to admit, longer than it needs. But thank you for the feedback.
Right. Awesome. So if we don't have any questions, I think what I'll do is, I think the paper is on SSRN as well. I'll just share the link as well so folks can read it. And thank you so very much once again for accepting our invite. And I really hope this paper finds a good home and we read it in the published format very soon.
Thank you, Anuj. It was a delight to present at your center, and feel free to reach out if you have any feedback on these and other work. I'm always looking for co-authors and research opportunities. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.